Hello, my name's Gavin, and this is Genre Books, and I'm going to start today with a spoiler warning. I don't normally do spoiler warnings. Hopefully I'm normally able to talk about books which are either so well known I don't need to give one, or where it's very obvious where the book is going. But as the first story I'm talking about today is a detective story, a whodunit. If you have not read Murders in the Rue Morgue by Edgar Allan Poe, then it's only 50 pages. Just read it. It's great fun. I'll see if I can figure out timestamps and put something in below so you can join us when we talk about the big fella. But I will be talking about Edgar Allan Poe pretty much from the off. Have you gone yet? Cool. Right. There's no big connection here. It just tickled me that I could at Easter read 3 books by 3 different people called Edgar, all about apes of varying sizes. Murders in the Rue Morgue and King Kong I read on Easter Monday, and A Fighting Man of Mars I read on Tuesday and Wednesday during my commute. These are my Easter Edgars, and there is no connection between them other than a bad joke. Let's start with Murders in the Rue Morgue to get it out of the way. It's a very rare reread for me. I think I first read this at university. Amongst Edgar Allan Poe's many claims to fame is that he really did start the detective story. C. Auguste Dupin is an amateur sleuth called upon sometimes by the police or the great and good in Paris to help solve seemingly unsolvable crimes. Although Poe calls his detectives' methods ratiocination, and Arthur Conan Doyle calls his detectives' methods deduction, we're talking the same thing here. Dupin appears in only 3 of Edgar Allan Poe's stories, The Murders in the Rue Morgue being the first, followed by, I want to say, The Mystery of Marie Roget, and then The Purloined Letter. And he uses the same methods of reasoning with a certain flourish that would be instantly recognisable to anyone who's read a Sherlock Holmes story. And now for the spoiler. The murders in the Rue Morgue are committed by an orangutan gone AWOL from a passing ship, even though Paris is some way inland. Nevertheless, the ape appears only in this ratiocination explanation from Dupin, and he's only an orangutan-sized orangutan. So big by any normal standards, but not great ape by any great ape standards. Giant Ape-ril being the reading event created by Roy Reads Anything, hosted by Roy and co-hosted by Annie at Obscure Book Adventures and Duncan from Back Away from the Donkey. And this is an event to read all about your man Kong, and also his gigantic brethren in the ape and general monster community. So let's talk about Kong. This is the book I read. This is written, the novelisation is by Delos W. Lovelace, based on an original idea from Edgar Wallace and Marion C. Cooper. Marion C. Cooper is the producer and director of the film King Kong. There is some interesting stuff with the authorship of King Kong, and the first really is figuring out quite how many people had a hand in the writing. This is made difficult because we're talking about both the book and the script. The original idea certainly comes from Marion Cooper. Edgar Wallace, who I'll talk about in a moment, is brought on to fashion a script and work as a script doctor on whipping the story into shape. But he dies before very much work is done and before the book is even started. And it may be interesting to think about how things might have turned out had he lived. But after his passing, a writer called James Creelman was brought in to work on the script. I don't think people were happy with that script, and a lady called Ruth Rose Schertzak was brought in. She had not started her career as a screenwriter. I think she was an archaeological writer on a trip to the Galapagos Islands. She met Miriam Cooper, who was filming the trip. I think it was a New York zoological expedition to the Galapagos Islands. The cinematographer was a man called Ernest Schutzak, who she met and married. But by all accounts, the things that she brings to the script are some of the more famous elements that people remember. She's the one who creates the Carl Denham figure to follow the pattern of Miriam Cooper. Her characterization of Jack Driscoll is apparently based on her husband, and she comes up with this concept of this is beauty that killed the beast, or comes up with the line certainly. So we have 4 creative minds involved in the process of writing King Kong before we even get to the novelisation, which is written by Delos W. Lovelace, who I don't think was known as a novelist, but certainly wrote some stories after this along with his wife, and was more famous for non-fiction works. King Kong is the first novelisation of a movie. Why Delos W. Lovelace is chosen, I don't know. I don't know if this is some sort of connection he had with Miriam Cooper. I don't know whether established writers would be a bit snobby or standoffish or worried about writing a book to fit a movie coming out. And at this point, Alan Dean Foster won't be born for another 16 years, so we can't ask him. I'm not going to delve too much into the lore and history of the genesis of King Kong. I think other channels are doing that with far much more research and aplomb than I can bring to bear on it. But from reading the book, having watched the film many years ago, it must be at least 15 years since I've seen it, it does seem to follow the script and story of the film very closely indeed. There is inklings of passages where we are looking at things through Kong's psyche, but these are short and fairly superficial. It's an enjoyable enough book, and while I do think the ending is slightly rushed, I remember getting to a certain point in the book and thinking, how are we going to fit New York in? But quibbles aside, it's deftly done. Obviously, I think for anyone reading the book past 1933, there is no real tension here. We know where the story is going, but I suppose if you're reading this in 1932, where the book came out before the movie, I wonder if you'd have seen this end coming. It seems to be fairly universally accepted that Edgar Wallace didn't have a huge hand in the writing of King Kong, but the fact that they kept his name attached to the project because he was such a famous writer at this point, and he certainly seems to come from that background of absolutely prodigious output that I do quite enjoy in Victorian, Edwardian and early 20th century pulp writers. There's over 170 novels. There are close to 1,000 short stories. His writing begins in journalism, not too far from where I work in London, in Ludgate Circus on Fleet Street. There is a plaque which pays homage not to his fiction output but to the impact he had on journalism. Edgar Wallace is possibly the only good thing ever to have come out of the Daily Mail, although he certainly does seem to share a number of the Daily Mail's prejudices. He's born into and grows up in poverty. He left school at 12. Writing for Wallace was a way to keep the walls from the door, not some sort of dilettante dabbling in what they might consider to be quite a nice line of work. He's doing this to live hand to mouth, and from 1905 to 1921, this seems to be his most sort of prolific output, is purely because there is a financial need to keep writing. And it's in 1921 that he is signed to Hodder and Stoughton, who start to market him properly. And this is the point in his career where he starts to encounter new things like advances and royalties. Everything he had sold prior to this, including scripts, although for I say scripts, that these are treatments for silent movies. Everything is done on spec and sold as is, with no imagining that there'd be any residual rights to anything. This all changes. He has some fairly major flaws. He's too much of a gambler. He's not an astute businessman. And even when his income skyrockets, he finds a way to go through all of that cash quite easily. But he is, by this point, the king of the thrillers, as his publishers say. And apart from being, at this point, a household name, and in some cases almost a sort of snidey, snobbish byword for perhaps productivity at the expense of quality, he also manages to score, quite by accident, a first in becoming the first sports broadcaster on the BBC, or the British Broadcasting Company as it was, rather than the British Broadcasting Corporation. So it hadn't even been turned into the semi-state-owned behemoth it is today. But he, because of his knowledge of horse racing, is reporting in 1923 from the Derby. You would hope that if he'd known just a little bit more about horse racing, he'd have won more often. But by the early 30s, he's found himself in Hollywood. King Kong is not the first movie he's worked on with Merian Cooper, but it's to be the last. He was an undiagnosed diabetic, and it's complications of the diabetes that he dies of. When news of this filters back to London, the bell of St Bride's Church in Ludgate at Fleet Street tolls as a mark of respect. There is another reading event on at the moment called Spring into Adventure, which has just been extended from 1 month to 2, and I think I might see if I can slip in another Edgar Wallace adventure story, because I surely haven't read enough. But we're not talking about just adventure, we're talking about a very specific giant ape adventure. And the other book I read this week featuring a giant ape is A Fighting Man of Mars by Edgar Rice Burroughs. Now, there's a giant ape on the front cover here. This is misleading on a couple of counts. Firstly, the giant ape in the book only really appears for one scene, and in a way doesn't appear at all because he is on the other side of a trapdoor to our hero and protagonist. But if you've read the first 7 books of the Barsoom series, as I have, you don't need to be able to see that ape to know what's happening behind that trapdoor. Another thing this book is misleading on is what the ape looks like. For instance, the Martian ape has 6 limbs. It has an extra pair between its legs and its arms, which functions as legs or arms depending on the need of the ape at the time. Another thing that John Carter readers will know is that other than the number of limbs, the fact that this is a big hairy ape is wrong in itself. The apes on Barsoom are, apart from a shock of white hair on the head, completely hairless. So the ape action is fairly limited here, but it hasn't always been in the Barsoom novels. John Carter in The Princess of Mars famously fights a couple of these beasts, and they turn up in the series all the way through. In Mastermind of Mars, one of the characters even manages to import his brain into the body of a great white ape, and we have him join Ulysses Paxton's merry crew as they do their adventuring. I would point out that other than the transplanted humans, the apes might be the only true mammals on Barsoom. All of the men from Mars, either the green men, the Tharks, or the red men, who would seem to fulfill every other mammalian requirement, are egg layers. The great apes are the only beings on Barsoom who give birth, what's the word, viviparously, as opposed to oviparously. No idea if I got those pronunciations correct. But lack of apes aside, this is still a great instalment in the Barsoom series. John Carter makes an appearance, but he's not the main character. This is, I think, the first time we have our first true sort of warrior hero of a Barsoom novel who doesn't have some kind of Barsoom imparted superpower. John Carter, of course, because he's used to, and Ulysses Paxton are used to the much heavier gravity and denser atmosphere of Earth, and therefore are able to show sort of superhuman prowess in strength and athleticism. This power is also somehow passed on to John Carter's son, Catharsis. Catharsis. But here, Hadron of Hastur is just a man of Mars. He's a fighting man of Mars, but he's just a man. And, with his eggs. And although limited to the strength of the other men, here he takes his inspiration very heavily from John Carter, who is by this point a warlord of Mars. He often thinks, what would John Carter do? What would John Carter say? How would John Carter act? And this helps Burroughs as well, because it means he doesn't really have to invent any unique or new characteristics for Hadron of Hastur. It's great knockabout fun, but I don't think it's not reaching the heights of those early first 3 installments of the Barsoom series. But we are not finished with the giant creatures yet. Next to come for Giant April from me will be reading Godzilla and Godzilla Raids Again. Gigantic, where we're going all Bigfoot and whatever the big beastie is in this book. I also started this morning The Lost World by Arthur Conan Doyle, full of ancient big creatures, and I'll give you my thoughts on this in my next Giant April video. Until then, goodbye.